It is only about 60 years since most African countries got their independence. During this time, Africa has traversed a number of challenges and navigated its way through some. This has been done with the aid of visionary leaders and resilient institutions. Nonetheless, some challenges persist as Africa's population grows. In addition, some of the continent's needs are mutating. For instance, in 1958, as most African states were gaining independence, the United Nations created an accompanying institution, the Economic Commission for Africa, the ECA, to encourage economic cooperation among newly independent UN member states. 5 years later, in 1963, as more and more African states got their independence, African leaders converged in Addis Ababa to create the Organization of African Union, the OAU. Later, the African Development Bank was founded as a continent development arm a year later in 1964. The United Nations Economic Commission, the African Development Bank, and the African Union Commission can arguably be said to be the institutional cornerstones upon which Africa's emergence has been anchored. Slow but steady, progress has been recorded with the African Union driving the continent's political multilateralism, the EAC driving the continent's research agenda and knowledge base, and the African Development Bank, the architect and financing mechanism for the continent's development agenda. Today, the EAC seat, which is headed by the Executive Secretary, is vacant pending the appointment of a permanent Executive Secretary, and the offices of the African Union Commission Chairperson, as well as the African Development Bank Presidency, will be transitioning to new leaders in 2024. But what kind of leaders should Africa be expecting? And what kind of leaders should the world be expecting from Africa? And what is the relevance of leadership, if any?
We will not achieve the Africa we want if we do not get for ourselves leaders that are conscious of the path that has to be walked.
The kind of leadership, the governance in place, so that these old or emerging causes or conflicts can be resolved. It doesn't make sense that our leaders cannot get themselves together to address problems affecting our people.
Africa must process food. Africa must package food. Africa must have quality standards on food. And Africa must export to others.
If Africa is to realize our dream, we must wake up. We must think of another Africa.
And if leadership matters, what challenges will Africa's post-2024 leaders inherit? This brings us to African challenges, a continent at crossroads. Severally, Africa has been touted for its potential, and some scholars have written about Africa's vast wealth of resources, while others have summarily, in lamenting the pace and growth path of Africa, described the continent as a sleeping giant. Post-2024, will Africa retain this tag of sleeping giants? And what role would a new configuration and partnership between the UNECA, African Development Bank, and the AUC play in either maintaining the current status quo or change the tides to awaken the giants? If Africa will emerge, Africans must tell their own stories.
Development can only happen when we have security. So the days are gone when security is looked at something for others. Security is now part of our own thinking in the bank, because we must support the countries to address security. So there must be a link between security, investment, growth, and development.
Reconfiguring African leadership, a new vision for Africa. To understand why today's African leaders think we must own our narrative, a diagnosis of Africa must first be carried out.
Africa and African leaders have realized that certain architecture must be put in place. Agenda 2063 is such architecture. I can see the reformation of the African Union.
We are talking about road infrastructure. I know the contractors, under the guise of something that they now call design and build, will even import steel from their countries, saying that ours has too much carbon content.
Look at West Africa in recent years. Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea. Look at all of those countries and try to think about the meltdown that has been brought about by failures in peace. Look at Central Africa, Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo. If you don't find the peace that is necessary to drive development, poverty alleviation, social welfare, well-being, infrastructural development, you keep working in the same cycle. We struggle to build, and then there is a war, there is conflict, we destroy. And then we start again, we struggle to build, there is a war, we destroy.
There is cause for concern as to how we need to ensure that these conflicts do not flare up. In terms of numbers, some statistics are showing that the number of conflicts, if they are numbered, are actually coming down. But it is worrying that even though it is coming down, some of them seem to be longer. They seem to be surviving long periods of effort. So
Africa needs an adequate political system which can bring an end of such misery.
African leadership, the way it is one element we need to solve our problem. And the best kind of political leadership in Africa that we need is democratic leadership.
Process, when we have judicial systems that are completely at the beck and call of the executive. How do you think that we can achieve the balance that is necessary to grow?
The United Nations Secretary General is in extensive consultations on who to appoint as UNECA's executive secretary. In the same breath, the African Development Bank is currently undertaking a wide consultative process on its new strategy 2024-2034.
Unlocking wealth in agriculture requires the provision of appropriate technologies to boost productivity, development of agricultural value chains, financial structure to support agricultural value chains, and investments in infrastructure to unlock investments by food and agribusinesses.
The agricultural take-off is not yet where we expect it to be. Some policies are there. The African Development Bank is working with many countries to put down the policies, but we have not been able to translate these policies into practical and applicable solutions where the ordinary Africans can see an increase in productivity, storage, transformations, as well as marketability of their products.
Unfortunately, arable land occupies only 6% of Africa's total land area, plunging Africa into food insecurity.
We do not even have the electricity, the resources, the roads to power and push this mechanization process so that we could move in agro transformation.
When you look at the basket of goods that are consumed in our countries, when you go to huge distribution centers, look at what we are buying. Look at the biscuits and tell me where they come from. Look at the rice. Rice is a disaster. I take the example of Cameroon. Cameroon had the potential, I'm talking about still has the potential, to produce enough rice to feed the whole of Central Africa.
In most countries in Africa, agriculture has largely been confined to subsistence farming and the use of rudimentary tools.
I think that it is time to fund agriculture.
During this time, the African Development Bank is equally working on the 10-year implementation plan for Agenda 2063, an agenda which has been uploaded the world over as Africa's blueprint for development. As such, there is a convergence of thought processes which suggest that Africa post-2024 will be different in its leadership, configuration and focus. This Africa will have to deal with some of the nagging challenges driving up to unemployment figures.
Tell me, if a young person was able to find a life, was able to find employment, was able to get the right education, was assured of health insurance, was confident that there is a future in this country, why would they go out? They would only go to Europe on tourism.
At the bane of this, an assessment of whether the current African and global institutional configuration is still fit for purpose. Africa has a lengthy and pressing to-do list as the mandates of African Development Bank's Adesina Akinwumi and the AU's Musa Mahatma Faki urged to a close in 2024. Some of the challenges that the continent must navigate are highlighted below. Security and armed insurgencies, youth and minority group despondency in the continent leading to intrastate violence, the use of terror and guerrilla wars by unconventional groups, and the proliferation of small arms and light weapons are three of the most pressing security challenges in Africa, which might renege as Africa reflects on its next continental leaders.